Hello again, friends out there on YouTube. Welcome to another video cast here by the Circle of Hope Pastors. I'm Joshua. With us today is Johnny and Rod, and we're here to continue this little series we've been doing of 9-minute unscripted, which reminds me I gotta get the clock going, unscripted dialogue around certain topics that people regularly ask us, and we think that they're relevant enough and useful enough to get more conversations going. So today we're talking about, somebody asked, what's the point of prayer? So Johnny, you think this is an easy one, do you?
Yeah, you said something like, well, I guess it is an easy one if you actually do it. And that's exactly what happened to me yesterday. I was in my spiritual formation class, and I was given the task of doing some centering prayer. And so we centered ourselves, and it was only for 10 minutes, so it wasn't even a very long time. But I used the prayer word and monitored my breathing and tried to free my mind of all the trouble of the world that plagued me, and it takes a little bit of practice, but even that act of centering is such a good way to find peace with God, find that oneness with the Father and with Jesus that Jesus is talking about in the farewell discourse when he's about to die and leave his disciples.
I think that people ask a question like, what's the point of prayer? Because they have been schooled to think that prayer is about making God do something or getting what I want or causing some kind of miracle that proves that I ought to have faith in what I believe and actually practice it. I think it's a really good question because I think that the subject of relating to God, conversing with God, connecting with God, prayer might be called, is big. God is big. So there's a lot of different reasons to pray, and it might be really hard to bring it down to just one point. And what you were just saying was about, one of the big points is about being at rest in that grace that I swim in and feeling like I'm okay, like I really am now that Jesus has saved me. But there's probably other reasons too.
Yeah, praying on behalf of somebody else, and I think wondering if that matters, if that makes a difference, or praying for situations like we do in our public meetings very often, praying even in solidarity with other people who are going through usually something pretty traumatic or a disaster. Does that matter, or why does it matter? I think is one of the questions the sub questions that is asked in that opening question.
The prayer to move God's heart is probably the one you guys are talking about. Intercession, praying for people that are suffering, praying for people that are sick with terminal illness. People pray for those things all the time. I was actually just visiting somebody in the hospital. I was praying for, he suffered maybe a stroke. They're not even sure exactly what happened to him. And I was praying with his parents and just hoping that God would move, give him peace, give him healing. Those kinds of prayers, when they don't get answered the way that we want them to, would make us ask that question.
I think a lot of people have, do ask that question as a real marker as to whether they're going to walk with other Christ followers or not, because it seems like the question that begs the answer, that God should be with us and should be doing whatever we ask. And I think that it's worth answering again and again when you have an example like you just gave, about why it is that I moved to pray, because I really need God to be in my present circumstances. I cry out to God because without God's presence I'm helpless, I'm hopeless. And I pray is just instinctively, like when we say, oh my God, because I'm always aware that something beyond me is not only necessary but relevant to what's what's happening in my present circumstances. So when I just before this, someone called me up and told me about how they lost their job, and of course I prayed about the job interview they're going to have in 20 minutes or so, or whenever, or tomorrow, or whenever they said they were going to have it, because what am I going to do if God isn't with me?
Mm. I wonder sometimes about those relatively small things on a large scope of, say, the entire planet, or especially, of course, human history, or even like the history of this all. How God moves in those tiny ways, or cares about those tiny ways, is really significant. I think the part of prayer is getting into the stream of God's big story, but there's something so wonderful about about God caring about these rather momentary things. And I think even disciplines like keeping a journal of what you're praying about is a really fascinating thing. So even afterwards, you look back and see, well, wow, I was praying for that 3 years ago, and look how it turned out. It may not have been how you wanted or expected, but you can see God move if you're looking for it, for sure.
Praying out loud, too, I learned, is such a good way to, when you're crying out to God, like you guys were talking about, and when you're journaling, too, it gives you a chance to confront what you're actually facing. It gets out of your head and in front of you, and that's a good place for healing and for self-discovery and understanding. God's there, ready to confront it with you and ready to change you, but it's such a good step. Here's what my prayers are, and you can actually list out the things that you're crying out for, and that alone is transformative.
I think, too, it bears saying, since we often think of prayer as the activity of getting God to move on our behalf, what's often said is that prayer is also listening. When Jesus is beginning his ministry, he's also tempted to pray and tell God what to do, to demonstrate some great power or authority over the world and therefore validate his own being. And he regularly says, no, I've already learned from God what is the answer to this situation. I don't need a new work of power or a new spectacular occurrence to validate my faith, because my faith was already resident with me before I got here. I was already related. I already know where I stand. I know who I am. And so listening and actually being aware of what is being said, what is the reality of the situation, listening to our own depth of spirit where God is already resident in us. This is all the activity of prayer, too. That is the other side of the intercession.
Totally. And to even get directed by God, I think prayer is so crucial to being able to, especially disciplines where at least once a day, that listening is what it's about. Trying to feel moved by God, to get God to move in the world. And we're all listening, or many of us are listening, we're going to get moved. I believe it, I've seen it, and I try to participate then regularly, but that definitely, for me, is a huge reason why I pray, is to get directed.
So I guess the point at which you're standing or where you begin might be as interesting in the point that you're trying to get to when it comes to prayer. I mean, if you think the center of prayer is what you are doing and what God's supposed to do for you, that would make a big difference in how you see what the outcome or what the point is. But if God is the point and you're entering in to where God is and being at that point, it might be a much larger place that you find yourself.
It's such a good point, Rod, because even the great prayers of the tradition, some of the desert fathers would suffer with the noonday demon. They would get bored with prayer. They would suffer with acedia. And even them would have that moment where they would wonder, well, what's the point of my existence? I've committed my whole life to praying, and now I have the question. And so when we have the question and we wonder about what the point is, we're in really good company, because some of the great prayers have also wondered that too, and I think that's encouraging.
Indeed. Well, time's up. Johnny and Rod, thank you. It's good to talk with you, and I hope this is useful for those watching. And like we say each time, please feel free to comment or add a question you'd like us to talk about. But like the videos, share them, and subscribe to our channel if you want to get more about what this is, what God's doing among us, and what we're talking through. So thanks for watching. See you next time.